Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this redgamingtech.com video we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. I hope you're all having an amazing day. We're going to kick the video off with a couple of pieces of AMD news, the first of which is the Radeon Adrenalin 19.9.2 drivers, which have now been released by AMD. They fix numerous bugs and issues that tends to be the case with new driver revisions, but also we see a 16% improvement in frame rate with the Radeon RX 5700 graphics cards with Borderlands 3. But the big reason I'm covering this particular piece of news is Radeon image sharpening is now available on select Polaris graphics cards. So if you have the 590, the 580, the 570, the 480 or the 470, you can now use Radeon image sharpening for DirectX 12 as well as Vulkan. So that means that not only does the 5700 series support Radeon image sharpening, but also those Polaris cards. And you may say to yourself, well, wait a minute, I've got a Vega 56 or a Radeon 7 or what have you. What about me? Well, I'm glad you asked, because AMD have issued a response of sorts to PC Games N. And I say of sorts because it's not really that great of a response, my opinion anyway. AMD will gauge end-user reception and demand for Radeon image sharpening, and will consider adding support for additional Radeon RX graphics cards in the future. End quote. So basically, if you keep poking them essentially on social media and posting on Reddit and the normal ways of communicating with companies, obviously don't be rude, but just kind of tell them that you want the feature, they may add it into the future. It is not promised. It is a bit weird on the surface that AMD are not supporting this with Vega, but I guess you can kind of think of it like this. It's weird that Vega, at least for graphics, obviously we're seeing compute architectures which are essentially based on an evolved Vega, but at least for discrete graphics for gaming anyway, most of the Radeon products which feature Vega are kind of end of line. Think of it this way, the Radeon 7 has all but been surpassed by the RX 5700 XT. It's a little slower, yes, but price-wise, most people would agree that you wouldn't really want to go with the Radeon 7 unless there are some fringe usage scenarios. For example, maybe you want to do some compute stuff as well, or maybe you just want the extra VRAM or what have you. Vega 56 and Vega 64 are pretty much the same thing. They're being kind of sidelined right now because of RDNA, and also Polaris, though, continues to be live and kicking because, well, we've not seen the lower end RDNA SKUs like the RX 5600 or whatever it ends up being called. So cards such as the 580 continue to be on the lists of the best value GPUs for people, and it's very hard to argue that an RX 580 is a bad purchase even now. They're really cheap. You can actually get them even cheaper on rebates. The 570 and the 580, you can get them for like under $200 in some cases, sometimes even considerably more than that, particularly if you're willing to go used. And of course, when you buy one of those cards, it's easily going to be enough to power 1080p. I've said this before on the channel, and I'll say it again, for a long time. Even despite when I owned a GTX 1080, I was still using an RX 480 in my main rig for gaming. Just because I was using the GTX 1080 mostly for channel stuff. And now I'm kind of like using the GTX 1080 as my main-ish card, sometimes still using the 480, and for RGT and testing I use the RTX 2080 Ti, because I like to separate things. I like to have my own personal system that I can kind of like throw games on and, you know, kind of mess around with, and then obviously a benchmark system and drives that I don't need to worry about. Okay, well, I can uninstall this and that type of thing. So for the most part, I try to keep hardware a little bit separate, and you know, the RX 480, particularly when overclocked and you do the normal tweaks, does a pretty admirable job. Anyway, I was really talking about that for too long. In technology, we always have had competing standards. For audio-visual, you might remember there was Blu-ray versus HD DVD, and obviously Blu-ray came out on top. Back before that, there was VHS versus Betamax, and obviously VHS came out on top. And with computer technology, when it comes to interconnect technology, we have had the CXL versus CCIX war. But CXL has come out on top. If you're unfamiliar with Compute Express Link, CXL, I have gone more in depth into this in the past, but if you're unfamiliar, it is a high-speed CPU to device or CPU to memory interconnect, and basically uses the PCIe 5.0 physical and electrical interface, i.e. it uses the PCIe 5 slots and the infrastructure there to have coherency in the CPU memory space as well as the attached devices which you would connect to the system. For example, a CPU and a GPU can share memory, which allows for higher performance, reduced latency, and so on and so on. CXL was founded by numerous companies, but perhaps one of the big leaders was Intel, although we also had Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, Facebook, Dell, Cisco, and many others. I'm not going to read out the entire list. But they've also had several other members more recently who are very well known join them, including AMD, ASRock, Fujitsu, and so on. But the most recent member that a lot of people are discussing who have joined the consortium are ARM. And ARM are extremely notable in their joining CXL because previous to that, they were big advocates of CCIX. Indeed, they were one of the biggest, probably actually the biggest supporter of CCIX. And now they're not abandoning CCIX, but what they are doing is kind of relegating it. I'm going to read out a quote. ARM brings to the table its track record in establishing a full software framework and aims to promote the migration to CXL as the interface to the accelerators and memory expansion. We expect to maintain CCIX support to inter-package chip-to-chip interface that is currently not in the scope of CXL, and we will continue to support customer solutions based on existing CCIX hardware. End quote. If you want the takeaway here, at least in my opinion, it's not so much that ARM have joined CXL, it's more that before we even have the hardware shipping, CXL won the war. Basically, it just picked up so much support with so many big companies, once again, like Intel, like Dell, like AMD, that essentially before anything really got sold to anyone, before any vendors picked up any physical hardware, the industry kind of settled on what the standards were, which is definitely great, because if you recall back in the day, if you were the one who bought a HD DVD player and then several months later you were like, oh, I see. I mean, it was great, I guess, technically back then in one way, that you could pick up movies for like a couple of bucks at the store, but after that it wasn't so much great. As a slight side note, I always found it kind of funny that Microsoft didn't push HD DVD with the Xbox 360 more than it did. It was kind of interesting the way that they kind of supported that back in the day. You remember the HD DVD attachment for the Xbox 360, right? So you could play movies. HD DVD. Wow, that is a pain in the ass to say. HD DVD movies on your Xbox 360 with a secondary attachment. Kind of weird. Anyway, so yes, this is definitely one of those instances where it's probably good for the industry. It essentially means that vendors who pick up hardware aren't going to be left out in the cold in, let's say, a couple of years' time with hardware which is essentially not supported either in hardware or software stacks, and that would definitely suck. And ARM have also reaffirmed support for Gen Z for its announcement. So yeah, this is one of those things where I'm actually really happy that a stand won, I guess, before we actually have any sales and anyone actually put down hard cash. And the final piece of news concerns Intel and Comet Lake. Gigabyte, as well as other motherboard manufacturers, are definitely gearing up for the launch of Comet Lake S and the 400 series platform. So what we have here are several listings on the EEC, which is the Euro-Asian Economic Commission, which is of course a certification office that electronics must pass. You shall not pass, or you shall pass, depending on whether or not they meet the criteria of the EEC. Now we have the first entries of the Z490 as well as the B460. Previously we have seen listings of other motherboards, the H410s, the Q470s as well as the H470s. So obviously these listings do tell us that we are getting closer-ish to the launch of Comet Lake. I don't think it's going to launch this year. There were some murmurs that Intel were rushing to push out the processors because of obvious pressure from AMD and the Ryzen 3000 series. I don't personally think that's going to happen. I personally think we're going to see Comet Lake launch next year, and with any luck, I think that they could be great processors for gaming. I don't think they're going to beat AMD for pure productivity, because I think the 3950X simply has too many processor cores. Even if we see all of the CPU cores of the 10 processor cores of the Comet Lake CPU hit, let's say 5 GHz. I don't know that for a fact. I'm just saying, let's just live in a pretend scenario for a moment. Let's say they all run 10 processor cores at 5 GHz. I don't think it's going to be enough to beat the 3950X in pure productivity with certain applications, but maybe for video encoding, for gaming, that type of thing, I think AMD will face a lot of pressure from Intel. So I'm quite looking forward to the launch of Comet Lake, because at the end of the day, more competition, more options for consumers is definitely a good thing, and I'm hoping as well we can overclock them reasonably. But my biggest hope, to be honest, is, well, that we see a similar pricing strategy for the 10-core processors, what we have the 8-core processors. So basically what I'm saying is that the 10-core processors are going to fit in roughly at the same price point as the current 9900K. I think that would be definitely the best move for Intel, because if they start charging $600–700 for a 10-core CPU, I think it's going to be really hard for people to justify that in their minds. The reason, because I know I'm going to get comments if I don't quickly tackle this, the reason we're seeing a different chipset here is because, from what I understand, who knows, maybe when people start playing around with it and modifying the boards and kind of messing around with BIOSes and that type of stuff, maybe they'll find a way of having the chips be backwards compatible. But because the power consumption of these CPUs is higher, it's 125 watts TDP, then obviously the current generation motherboards, the 300 series, excuse me, like the Z490, basically they're concerned about power delivery. So that's why we're seeing yet another iteration of boards, which is definitely a shame. It would be nice if you could run a Z490 motherboard, for example, on a 10th generation CPU. But with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Take care of yourselves, and bye for now.